Everything You Feel is Real. We have with us May Abdalla, who's the Executive Director of Anagram, who will demonstrate the sensory power of immersive theater and storytelling. And we are asking everyone to keep their masks up if they're not actively eating or drinking. Thank you so much. Welcome, May.
Hi. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So, yes, as I was introduced, I run a studio in London and Bristol in the UK called Anagram, and we make immersive experiences that, from its very outset, have been about non-fiction stories and finding ways to understand them on a deep level. So I have another talk, which is online, which is about the project that we have here at the arcade, which is called Goliath, Playing with Reality. So I'm not going to talk very much about Goliath. I will a little bit. I'm just going to play the trailer so you guys get a sense of what that is. And then, I encourage you to see it at the arcade if you have time in the next couple of days, because it's kind of encapsulates some of the thinking and the approach that we have as a studio towards storytelling. So just a quick show of hands. Who here is a creator? Oh, yeah, great. I mean, if you're not a creator, it's fine, but it's just good to it's good to know who's in the room, because a lot of what I'm talking about is process. So yeah, here is a quick trailer.
Can you tell the difference between what is and isn't real? When the one thing that links you to the outside world disappears, where does that leave you? Everything you see is just part of the game. Everything you feel is real.
So Goliath is a VR experience, as you see. It's kind of part game, part storytelling. But when we founded Anagram 10 years ago, we weren't working with VR. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the very outset and kind of why we decided to set up the studio. When I say we, it was me and a friend called Amy. That's why we called it Anagram, because my name is May. That's that. So before Anagram, I worked as a documentary filmmaker and journalist. And the thing that I really cared about was trying to tell stories of other people whose lives we couldn't experience. And I worked mainly in TV. I worked for the BBC and people like that. But there was definitely a frustration I had with the medium of film and television, a sense that the screen was just another way of like othering or kind of making kind of our experiences and the experiences of other people feel different. And initially, Anagram was really just an exploration of what happens if you bring your body into a story? What happens if the experience of understanding something doesn't come like through your mind in a cerebral way, like, oh, this is a crisis in Myanmar, and I'm thinking deeply about it. What was the kind of platform that also existed in the human body? And kind of that question really is the beginning of how we ended up working in VR 10 years later. So the key thing in all the projects that we make, some of which are installations or audio walks or site-specific adventures, for those of you guys who kind of know immersive theatre, it's a big thing in London. Punch Drunk, I think, have made it here, but there's all these different kinds of people. But the thing that really ties it together is there's always something that you need to do, something that is not like a hypothetical thing that you think about doing, but that you actually do. And so the very first project we made, which I'm going to talk about partly because it also kind of was the first project we brought to New York, was called Door into the Dark, and it ended up winning the Tribeca Storyscapes Award in 2014. So Door into the Dark is a story about what it means to be lost. And the interesting thing, I think, about choosing the subject of being lost is because, to some degree, I think the thing that kind of groups all of our work together is an interest in trying to get you, as a participant, to do something where you don't really know what it's going to feel like until you've tried it. And for those of you that know Rilke, the famous poet, this is kind of a quote that really inspires like why that's interesting to me. He writes, "The point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." And that is an approach that kind of really comes from this question of like, how do we change? How do we evolve? Or how do we loosen up our kind of habits and our approaches to how we see ourselves and subsequently the world around us? Can we almost use storytelling as a kind of prototype for alternative versions of ourselves? So I'm going to play you a trailer for Door into the Dark. So the context, because it's kind of hard to see this in the trailer, it's a blindfolded experience. So, pause you for a second there. It's a blindfolded experience. It takes place in a huge empty set that you never see because you're blindfolded. And effectively, you arrive at a door. You go by yourself. You have to take your shoes off. And after you wait for the person who's just finished to come out of this space, they put your hands, they put you inside a darkened headset. It's not a VR headset. It's very low tech. They take your hands, they place it on a rope, and all you do is follow the rope and listen to the stories of people who have been lost in different ways. No, it just needs to do that thing again.
This is a labyrinth. For now, all you need to do is follow the rope.
When you're blind, there's no sun except there's warmth. There's no blue skies, no clouds. There are no walls. There are no limits to your world. You are a body standing on something in space.
Can you feel the hairs on your cheeks? Are they wide awake? Where are you?
You know, you're in a state of mind where if one of us falls, we're going to die. You find yourself trying to cut off from those thoughts. But at the same time, if you allow yourself to know what the situation is, it's exerting kind of pull. What would it be like to take the fall? I sense that urge, the urge to surrender, to avoid.
So why is it interesting to think about yourself being lost? And the book was very much inspired by a book called A Field Guide to Getting Lost by Rebecca Solnit, in which she writes, "To be lost is to be fully present. And to be fully present is to be capable of being in uncertainty and mystery." So as part of the journey in Door into the Dark, you know, there are many different associations that we as individuals all feel very differently about what it means to be lost, not just in the geographical sense, but also in the moments in our lives where something happens that we are not prepared for, where the very fabric of what we expect has kind of dissolved. And so as part of the journey, I'm going to kind of give a spoiler away, but you know, it's a very old project and it might not come back. As part of the journey, you know, you travel through the space, and I'm going to show you like the first diagram of what happens in the space in a second. But you travel through the space, and then and you've left your things in a locker in the first room. And then when you come back to that room, you two have to show the next person what to do. So you take off your headset and you give it to them. They take their shoes off and place them in the locker. And then you guide them and you put their hands on the rope and you tell them to follow. And then at that moment, when you leave the room, you realize actually you're not where you thought you were. You have actually left a room which is an identical replica of the room where you started. So it becomes this like initial experiment with having gone through this journey. Now you're temporarily lost in a small kind of physical way. How do you respond to the idea of not knowing where you are? So really it's being lost on like a metaphorical and on a physical sense. And so when we approached this, because as I said, my background was filmmaking, initially the diagram that we kind of tried to figure out what that journey would look like, we thought of it a little bit like a film. And in a film, there's a story arc and there's a hero. But in this, you're the hero. So you need to go through a certain number of challenges. You need to kind of be challenged in order to, do something that you wouldn't have done otherwise in order to basically end transformed. Of course, like, it's not a mathematical formula, but like, let's just indulge that life was that simple. And so initially, in this kind of quite naive diagram that we made 10 years ago, there are moments where like, well, we want you to feel cared for. We want you to feel bold. There's moments of surprise, intrigue, a moment of fear, a moment of ecstasy. So that was kind of the ambition. But then how do you translate those things kind of purely in a sensory sense? What feels scary? What feels ecstatic? And we spent several weeks blindfolded in various friends' houses, kind of being pushed around, trying to figure out how we felt in different setups. There's a kind of a place in Bristol called the Children's Scrap Store where we could surround ourselves in sponges or silk scarves and figure out what the feeling was. And so although nobody actually was allowed to ever see backstage, the reality of what it looked like and the reality of what people imagined were kind of hugely different, because blindfolded, listening to the voices that you kind of heard earlier and thinking about your inner journey, you kind of imagine something very different from the extremely kind of cheaply built and kind of bootstrapped together set. But what you can see in this diagram is something that we called the bed. So the bed, this question of we needed to have a moment of ecstasy, something where you feel powerful and wonderful. It's a difficult brief. And eventually we came up with this idea of the bed. So at some point you're instructed to lean against a wall and very slowly, as kind of choral violins play very loudly in your headphones, the wall begins to tip backwards. And the wall is in fact 19 inches of foam covered in like the softest materials we could find. And so you find yourself sinking as if on a cloud. It's easier to surprise people when they can't see anything. But this picture doesn't do justice to the inner experience. But effectively, like, Door into the Dark was our first experiment with being really obsessed with designing an inner experience, kind of not caring at all what it looked like, or it was just, how do you take somebody's guts with you on a journey and make sure that they don't chicken out at any point, that they trust you enough to kind of go through the whole thing. And like, the crazy thing is, it was 45 minutes long, you're in the dark, and the whole time it ran in like 6 different countries. Only 2 people ever asked to stop. And one of them was the person who'd commissioned it. So I knew everything about it. But that explains why she was so into it. She needed it more than anyone else. And so then, kind of, if our like overly bold desire had been to make a transformative experience, I know how kind of arrogant that sounds, we felt that we perhaps did manage that. I particularly like what Michelle said. I felt so zen afterwards, like I've been on ecstasy or just finished 3 hours of yoga. I'm still feeling the after effects. But really, like, those after effects, I think, could not have happened if you hadn't taken somebody beyond the edges of their comfort zone in a way where they discovered something about themselves that they then take with them. We have no idea what those things were, but we can only guess by their look of bliss afterwards that they'd overcome something and they'd allow themselves to be vulnerable and kind of vanquished something in their lives. But what it was, I have no idea. So, yeah, I guess, so now it's like a bit of a whistle stop through 4 different projects to kind of explain a little bit kind of the approach, like I said, like the method. And in a way, Door into the Dark, we kind of cut our teeth in an indulgent way. We made an experience for one person at a time that took 45 minutes and never made any money. And so then we decided to be like really smart and like business minded. And we made an experience. Oh. That's the wrong slide deck. No, we made an experience for 2 people at a time. But I realized that I was going to talk about something else, which was mainly something which kind of was kind of in the back of our minds, which was, as I said, like my background in journalism, sometimes was the challenge was trying to change people's minds by using their intellect as opposed to trying to warm people up by using their bodies. And actually this slide is related to, I guess like most people have heard this, but smiling actually makes you feel happier. You don't have to necessarily wait until you've reached a happy moment to smile. There is an impact on kind of asking your body to do something and your mind will follow. So that's the kind of hopeful pop neuroscientist chat which is behind some of these assumptions. So, yes, the 2-person experience. So we then, after a few kind of different permutations, but our first foray into VR was this piece called The Collider. And The Collider was for 2 people at a time. And we thought what would be interesting to get 2 people who are strangers to do together was to think about power dynamics, to think about you as an individual. When you find yourself with someone else, what are your tendencies? Do you tend to dominate? Do you allow them to dominate? Why are those things? It's a very personal question. And I think, to some degree, we made this in stuff was going on in world politics, which I can't remember what. But we wanted to think about, like, the wider political systems. And in a way, how can you think about the wider political systems if you don't think about your own tendencies and how power is apparent and clear in your own life? And there's a couple of artworks by this brilliant guy called Alan Wexler, which he tried and create these systems that only worked if everybody cooperated, or could only work if somebody didn't cooperate. So we're like, how can we create a situation where it becomes apparent how you've chosen and what side you are on? And so the Collider is a 2-person experience that takes place in VR, but also like in a physical set. And it kind of started because we were really interested in what happens when you detach the controller from the headset. That sense that you, as the person in the headset, can't control what happens next. But then if you are outside and controlling somebody else's world, you can't see what you're doing, but you can see that you're having an impact. So could that be like the basis of like a playful relationship that could, in the doing, give you something fertile to reflect on? So these are some like early, what we call physical messings about that we do sometimes. And so what happens in the Collider is you start off separately in these kind of antechambers, and you're asked either to think of a memory where you had power over someone else, or you think of a memory where somebody had power over you, and you reconstruct these scenes in these little glass cake stands, and then you enter a space kind of separately, one person in the headset and one person with the controller. So you don't actually see each other. And a series of challenges and stories are performed through that experience. And then on the other side, you meet for the first time and you have a conversation about what part of the story you saw. I'm kind of wrestling through this. It's very difficult to explain everything, but you get the gist. And in a similar way, people's responses to the Collider were really profound. But a lot, and so I'm just going to read a little bit of this. So this was one of the reviewers who'd written, "The experience has moved something inside me. I can't tell you what has changed, but I'll take this with me for the rest of my life." But that thing of the kind of spaciousness of the content, perhaps, it kind of provokes, initially, it's quite a playful story around a machine that is trying to scan the space between people to understand what happens when two people meet. And then it slowly becomes more about your inner memories and thinking about those memories together. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to understand what you're saying, can you tell us a little bit more what you would see in the VR set? Like
Yeah.
What you're actually doing?
Okay, so what you would, I did take those slides out because I know this isn't a long enough talk for me to talk about it, but I'm going to tell you. So the person in the headset is, they see a mixture of things that are like animation, but then also when the second person arrives in the space, it's they see kind of what that person is doing as particular kind of representations of a person. So they might see, so let's say you're in the headset and I'm outside the headset, you'll see like a figure, and as I move, but in a way you'll probably project. You don't know who is really generating that figure, but you eventually realize that figure is with you in the space. And then the various things you're asked to consider, like might associate that figure with, you know, your early memories of being at school, or different things which are related to kind of how you see yourself in relationships with different kinds of people. So it's like an abstract representation of people and dots. There you go. But yes, if you look at the website, it's got more visuals on that. So, and I'm just going to, yes, it's difficult to explain these things very quickly because, you know, in many ways, we were never really that limited to thinking about a particular form. It always just began with how can you create an experience that's going to make somebody able to consider this and reflect on it in a different way. So what kind of motivated it was, you know, yeah, just seeing what are the circumstances and the actions that somebody needs to do to think about this in a different way. And so really the VR, the visuals of the VR, kind of it's more just like the idea that you're with somebody and you can't see what they're doing, or you can't see how they're experiencing, and how that is actually a little bit like me and you now. Like, I'm with you, but I really have no idea how you're experiencing this talk. Is it okay? So then, and so I'm going to mention another project which we kind of have been working on also, which is called Messages to a Post-Human Earth. If anyone lives in London, it's on at the Welcome next month. But you probably don't live in London if you're here. And I think we wanted, you know, having thought about these kind of, let's say, the micro politics of your everyday experience and how your inner world and your outer world kind of connect. Messages to a Post-Human Earth is an experience about how we see the natural environment and how we relate to plants and whether or not we consider them kind of, where we consider them on the realm of intelligence. And it's also trying to challenge some of those assumptions that we have in terms of a kind of invisible hierarchy in species in the world. And so, let me play you the trailer.
Hello, human person. This is not the beginning, because of course, you have been going for a while. Around you are the signs of things that are moving on this journey with you. One afternoon in her lab, a biologist Monica Gagliano plays the sound of running water to her plants and observes as their roots start to move towards her. You will be asked to face the future, a world without you. The person in front of you will explore the past, and so you will have to lose each other, but not yet.
So what happened, I realize we're running out of time. So just to give you a little bit more of beyond the abstract trailer, what takes place. It's basically an interactive audio walk that you do with a group of people in a park, which mixes kind of this fantastical narrative about the world after humans with, let's say, a kind of cosmic AR of kind of what plants can do that we don't yet understand, and the possibilities for different levels of communication. And some of the science, like, for example, the work of Monica Gagliano, which is around plant communication and plant acoustics, some of the questions that we haven't quite yet solved. So it is a little bit of science, but it's kind of also about the limits of science and kind of the edges of our perception. So quickly now, because I know Joyfully Apocalyptic is probably my favorite review. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes just looping back to Goliath, because in the context of this kind of work and this kind of approach, in many ways, like, Goliath is, it uses VR and perhaps kind of with the same intention as some of these less kind of technical projects, which was trying to help people understand what it means to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, what it means to live with a condition like schizophrenia. And the reason that we wanted to do this was kind of multifaceted, but everybody in the team knows somebody kind of, or is kind of personally affected in some way. But there's some really shocking statistics around what a diagnosis for schizophrenia means to you as an individual. Effectively, you have 20 years shorter life expectancy, and this isn't really because of the medical condition. It's a lot to do with the isolation that people experience as a result of society's very strong prejudices against a condition that's so, like, clearly associated with violence and death and scary movies. And so we have to wrap up, right? So I'm just going to skip this little video. And I'm going to invite you to go and see the piece. But a big part of our motivation to making the project was to try and also use it as a kind of tool to help people who work with people with mental health problems understand the reality of what they go through. And so very early on, like our very initial focus group with people with these diagnoses, we asked them, if you can make a VR experience about what you go through, who would you like to see it? And they were like, oh, our doctors, which we found really shocking, because we're like, doctors, surely they know everything, right? They're the smart guys in the room. But sometimes being smart, kind of, maybe this is the theme of the talk, being smart is a problem. Rumi actually has a brilliant quote, which is like, sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. And maybe one of the reasons I like VR, and maybe I won't like it in 10 years when everybody kind of gets it, is it is kind of a bewilderment tool. Like, when I watch people go into Goliath and they're like, what are my hands doing? You're like, imagine if we could walk around and be like, what are my hands doing? The kind of like vulnerability of that is kind of profound. But so, yeah, one of the amazing kind of moments for us is kind of watching doctors do Goliath and say stuff like, even though this guy is the medical director of quality improvement, say stuff like, I can see I have very fixed ideas about mental illness and schizophrenia, and this is going to make me reappraise those assumptions and relate to patients. But, fundamentally, it isn't because somebody told them, it's not a set of symptoms. It's really about putting them in an experience which, if you do the project, you'll see is very much about the physical sensation of being lost. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Obviously, I know people who want to be someplace else at noon. You can take this door out as well if you are hoping to get to another session. We are about to start from the classroom and after school to the studio, which is a panel. Give us 2 minutes to set up the chairs.